He said nothing. He just set down his mop and looked at the board. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from normal quiet. It was the kind that happens when people are waiting to see someone humiliate themselves. Nobody expected what came next. Raymond Okafor had been mopping the hallways of Caldwell Medical Institute for 11 years. He arrived at 5 in the morning when the parking lot was still empty and the building smelled of floor wax and recycled air. He wore the same gray uniform every day, not because he didn't own others, but because he saw no reason to dress differently for work that would get you dirty anyway. He drove a 2003 Buick with a cracked dashboard and a rear bumper held in place by a strip of industrial tape. The security guards knew him by name. The janitors on the other floors knew him by sight. The doctors and researchers who occupied the upper levels of the institute barely knew him at all. That was fine with Raymond. He preferred it that way. He was 58 years old, though. He had crow's feet around his eyes and hands that told the story of his life more clearly than he ever would. Large, careful hands, knuckles scarred from years of physical work, nails always clean despite everything. He kept his gray-streaked hair cut close to his head. When he smiled, which wasn't often, it started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. He had a son named Marcus, who was 14 and played chess badly but practiced every night on the kitchen table. Raymond would sit across from him sometimes and let the boy think he was winning. Other times, when Marcus grew frustrated and sloppy, Raymond would take apart his entire strategy in 4 moves, not to be cruel, to show him what discipline looked like. His late wife, Carolyn, had been the one with the words, the warmth, the way of filling a room simply by walking into it. She had died 6 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. Raymond had held her hand at the end, and then driven home alone and sat in the kitchen until Marcus woke up for school. He hadn't cried then. He cried later, in the parking lot of the grocery store, with a bag of oranges in his lap, for no reason he could explain. Since then, he had learned to carry grief the way you carry a heavy coat in warm weather, folded under your arm, never quite put down. He kept books in a milk crate under his bed. Medical texts, mostly. Biochemistry, cellular biology. A worn copy of molecular oncology that he'd found at a library sale years ago and read until the spine gave out. He had bought a new copy. He had read that one too. Nobody at Caldwell Medical Institute knew this. He had never told them. There had never been a reason. The conference room on the 4th floor was called the Westbrook Room, named after a donor whose portrait hung near the door with the expression of a man deeply satisfied with himself. On a Tuesday morning in late March, the room was set up for the monthly Grand Rounds presentation, a formal case discussion attended by the Institute's senior physicians, 3 visiting researchers from a university affiliate program, and a handful of residents who sat in the back and tried to look like they belonged there. The presenter was Dr. Helena Marsh. She was 44 years old, with a publication record that ran to 47 peer-reviewed papers and a reputation inside the institute that preceded her into every room she entered. She was precise in her speech and precise in her opinions. She had a particular way of tilting her head when someone said something she found elementary, a small, controlled motion, barely visible, that nonetheless communicated everything. People who worked under her had learned to recognize it. They had also learned to say nothing when they did. She was presenting a case that had been troubling her department for 3 weeks. A patient, she referred to him only as Patient C in her slides, had arrived with a constellation of symptoms that didn't fit cleanly into any existing diagnostic framework. Lab results that contradicted each other. Imaging that pointed in 4 different directions. 2 of her residents had suggested diagnoses that she had rejected. A visiting physician had proposed a 3rd possibility that she had listened to with her head tilted slightly to the left. The central problem, she explained, was a protein marker that appeared in concentrations their current models couldn't account for. The marker suggested systemic inflammation. The symptom presentation suggested something else entirely. The gap between the 2 was, she told the room, what made the case genuinely interesting. She pulled up a slide. On it, a graph, the protein concentrations over time, plotted against treatment response. The trajectory here, she said, gesturing with her laser pointer, simply doesn't follow any documented pattern, which means either the patient is anomalous or our framework is incomplete. There was a brief silence. Then, one of the visiting researchers asked a question about the initial baseline measurement. Raymond had been in the back of the room since 8:15. He was not supposed to be in the back of the room. He had come to replace a ceiling tile near the ventilation panel. Someone had filed a maintenance ticket the week before about a discoloration in the drop ceiling, and the tile needed to come out and be checked for water damage. He had come early to do it before the room filled up, but the meeting had started earlier than the schedule indicated, and by the time he understood what was happening, the room was full, and Dr. Helena Marsh was at the front with her slides and her laser pointer, and leaving now would mean walking across the room while she was speaking, so he stayed. He stood near the back wall with his toolbox at his feet and watched the presentation. He watched it for 18 minutes before he understood what the problem was. He didn't say anything at first. He watched the graph. He watched Dr. Marsh explain the anomaly. He watched the visiting researchers lean toward each other in low conversation. He looked at the numbers on the slide. He had memorized them without trying to, and he thought about a paper he had read 14 months ago in a journal he'd found at a university library downtown, a paper about cascade signaling an atypical inflammatory response, and the way that paper's model fit the shape of these numbers with a precision that felt almost physical, like a key turning. He was not going to say anything. That had been his decision, made quickly and quietly, the way he made most decisions. Then a resident in the back row, young, eager, the kind of young that hasn't yet been worn into caution, raised his hand and suggested a diagnosis that Raymond knew, with complete certainty, was wrong. Not approximately wrong, fundamentally wrong. The kind of wrong that, if acted on, would send the treatment in a direction that would cost the patient weeks. He looked at the resident. He looked at the graph. He picked up his toolbox and set it quietly against the wall. "Excuse me." His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man who had learned that the room would quiet if you waited for the right moment. Dr. Helena Marsh turned from the whiteboard. There was a beat, a half-second of confusion, as she took in the gray uniform, the toolbox on the floor, the man standing in the back of her conference room. "Can I help you?" she said. "I think there's a problem with the model," Raymond said. "I'm sorry to interrupt." The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. This one had texture to it. One of the visiting researchers set down his pen. A resident looked up from his notes. Dr. Marsh's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch. "The model," she repeated. "The protein trajectory," he said. "It's not anomalous. The baseline measurement was probably taken too early in the cascade. If you shift the window by about 72 hours, the curve fits the Hargrove signaling pattern. There was a paper on it, 2022, I think, in the Journal of Translational Immunology. Atypical cascade sequencing in late-stage inflammatory response." No one in the room moved. Dr. Marsh looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "You're the maintenance worker," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You've read the Hargrove paper. I've read it a few times." She turned back to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker. She was quiet for a long moment. "Walk me through it," she said. He was at the board for 40 minutes. He did not have the language of medicine the way the physicians in that room had it. The smooth, professional fluency of people who had spent decades inside the vocabulary. His sentences were sometimes angular, and he paused occasionally to find the right term, and once he wrote something down, and then corrected it without being asked. But what he had was the thing underneath the language. He understood the mechanism. He understood why the numbers did what they did, and he could show the logic of it in a way that moved from one step to the next without gaps. Dr. Marsh asked him 3 questions. Hard questions, the kind she used to probe the edge of what someone actually knew versus what they thought they knew. He answered 2 of them completely. On the third, he paused and said, "I'm not sure. I don't know the literature on the immunosuppressant interaction well enough to say." That answer, one of the residents would later say, was the most credible thing he'd heard in a grand rounds presentation in 2 years. When Raymond finished, he stepped back from the board and looked at what he'd written. Then he looked at the room. The visiting researcher who had set down his pen earlier had picked it up again and was writing quickly. The resident who had given the wrong answer was looking at his own notes with an expression Raymond recognized. The expression of someone reviewing everything they'd said from the beginning, measuring it against a new standard. Dr. Marsh was looking at the board. "The 72-hour window," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. It's just a hypothesis, Raymond said. You'd need to pull the original draw times and replot it. It might not hold. It'll hold, she said. She still had her back to him. He picked up his toolbox. I'll come back for the ceiling tile another time, he said. I'm sorry for the interruption. He was at the door when Dr. Marsh turned around. Wait! He stopped. She looked at him the way she looked at problems that interested her, directly, without much ceremony. What's your name? Raymond Okafor. How long have you worked here, Raymond? 11 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then, where did you study? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the milk crate under his bed and the library on Fletcher Street that let you use the academic database terminals for 2 hours at a time if you had a card. He thought about Carolyn, who had said once that his mind was a room that was always lit and that it was a shame he kept the curtains closed. I didn't, he said, not formally. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said, for the interruption. He nodded once. Then he walked out into the hallway, where the lights buzzed faintly and the linoleum was beginning to scuff near the elevator bank, and he made a note on his clipboard about the ceiling tile, and he went on with his day. He didn't tell Marcus about it that evening. They ate dinner, chicken and rice, the same thing they had most Tuesdays, and Marcus talked about a problem he was having with his chess opening, and Raymond listened and offered one observation, which Marcus immediately dismissed and then, 10 minutes later, quietly incorporated. After dinner, Raymond washed the dishes and dried them and put them away. He made sure Marcus had finished his homework. At 9:30, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a copy of a paper on immunological cascade research that he'd printed at the library the week before. He read it once straight through. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly, making small marks in the margins with a pencil. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments get quiet late at night. Not empty, but resting. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed and its headlights moved across the ceiling. He thought about the Westbrook room, about the graph on the slide and the shape the numbers made. He thought about Carolyn, the way he always eventually thought about Carolyn, not with the sharp edge it used to have, but with something steadier now, something more like a hand resting on a table than a door slamming shut. He finished his coffee. He folded the paper and put it back in the folder on the shelf above the stove, next to the other folders, each one labeled in his careful small handwriting. He turned off the kitchen light. 3 days later, Dr. Helena Marsh appeared in the east corridor on the ground floor at 7:40 in the morning, which was not a place she typically appeared at 7:40 in the morning. She was carrying a patient file and a cup of coffee, and she looked like someone who had not slept especially well. Raymond was cleaning the window at the end of the corridor. She said his name from 10 feet away and he turned around. The 72-hour replot, she said. It held. Good, he said. She walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with the same direct expression as before, but something else in it now, something he didn't have a name for. Patient C responded to treatment this morning, she said. First real response in 3 weeks. Raymond nodded. I want to ask you something, she said. All right. Why haven't you said anything before? 11 years. You've been in those rooms. You've heard those presentations. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window he'd been cleaning, at the smear of gray light outside. It wasn't my place, he said. That's not an answer. He looked at her. Nobody asked, he said, and I didn't have any reason to think they'd want to. She was quiet then. The corridor was empty except for them. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed. I want you to talk to someone, she said. A colleague of mine. She runs a research program at Harrington University. I've told her about you. You've told her about me. She wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on a project, informally at first. She works on cascade signaling. Raymond set down his cleaning cloth. He looked at the floor, then at Dr. Marsh. Why? He asked. It was a genuine question. Not suspicious. He wasn't a suspicious man, but genuine. He wanted to understand the logic of it. Dr. Helena Marsh considered for a moment. Because you were right, she said simply. And being right is worth more than where you went to school. He thought about Marcus at the kitchen table, moving chess pieces in the lamplight. He thought about the milk crate under his bed. He thought about Carolyn, who had always said the curtains were meant to be opened. All right, he said. Dr. Marsh nodded. She looked like she had more to say and then decided against it. She turned to go. Dr. Marsh, she stopped. Thank you, he said, for asking. She looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time in Raymond Okafor's 11 years at Caldwell Medical Institute, Dr. Helena Marsh smiled at him, a small, brief, real smile, the kind she apparently didn't distribute often. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just show up." He showed up. He continued to show up at 5 in the morning for his shift at the institute, and he showed up twice a month at Harrington University, in a research lab on the 3rd floor of the biology building, where a researcher named Dr. Yolanda Cruz had covered half a whiteboard with cascade diagrams and had a habit of talking very fast when she was excited about something. She was excited about most things. Raymond found her company bracing in a way he hadn't expected. In the lab, he was careful to say when he didn't know something. He was equally careful when he did. Dr. Cruz had initially treated him with a kind of watchful uncertainty, not unkindness, but the measured reserve of someone waiting to see if an unusual thing would prove itself. By the 3rd session, that had changed. By the 6th, she had started emailing him papers between meetings. He did not tell people at the institute about Harrington. He did not tell people at Harrington about the institute beyond what was already known. He drove to his sessions in the Buick, and he parked in the visitor lot, and he went up the stairs because the elevator was slow. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore, not the gray uniform, but not far from it. Marcus found out on a Sunday morning in October, when he came downstairs and found his father on the phone, standing at the kitchen counter, nodding slowly and saying things like, "Right, and the 2023 replication data is the issue, and I'd need to see the secondary markers before I'd say that." Marcus stood in the doorway in his socks and watched his father talk for 4 minutes. When Raymond hung up, he saw his son and did not immediately say anything. "Who was that?" Marcus asked. "Someone I work with. At the hospital?" "At a university." Marcus was quiet for a moment, parsing that. Then, "What do you do there?" Raymond thought about how to explain it. He poured himself a cup of coffee. "I look at problems," he said, "and try to figure out what's causing them." "Like at the hospital." "Something like that." Marcus picked up a piece of toast from the counter and ate it standing up the way he always did, looking at his father with the expression he got when he was working something out. "Is that why you have all those books under your bed?" he said. Raymond looked at his son. "Yes," he said, "that's why." Marcus chewed his toast. He nodded once, slowly the way Raymond nodded, a gesture the boy had learned without knowing he was learning it. "Okay," Marcus said, and he went to get his chessboard. The following April, a paper was submitted to the Journal of Translational Immunology. It concerned cascades signaling an atypical inflammatory response and the implications for diagnostic timing in a specific class of late-presenting cases. There were 4 authors. The 4th name on the list was Raymond Okafor, listed without institutional affiliation. Dr. Yolanda Cruz had insisted on it. She had said, in her quick and certain way, that the observation about the 72-hour window had reoriented the entire research question, and that the person who made an observation like that belonged on the paper, and that was the end of the conversation. Raymond had said he didn't need to be on it. She had said that what he needed and what was right were 2 different things. He had not argued further. He was not in the habit of arguing with people who were correct. He found out the paper was accepted on a Wednesday afternoon when he was mopping the 3rd floor corridor of the institute. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he looked at it and read the email and then put his phone away. He finished mopping the corridor. He wrung out the mop and put it in the cart and pushed the cart to the service elevator and went down to the supply room on the basement level. He filled out his end-of-shift report. He washed his hands at the utility sink. He drove home in the Buick. He made dinner. He asked Marcus about school. He listened to his son describe a chess match he had won against a kid in his class with more enthusiasm than tactical accuracy, and Raymond let him finish and then said, "You left your queen exposed for 3 moves. He should have taken her in the 2nd one." Marcus groaned. "He didn't notice." "He will," Raymond said. "When he's better, make sure you're better first." After dinner, he took the milk crate out from under his bed and set it on the floor and looked at the books in it. The molecular oncology, 2 editions now. The biochemistry texts, a stack of printed papers. Some of them read so many times the ink had faded along the fold lines. He thought about Carolyn. He thought about what she would have said, and he could hear it so clearly it almost wasn't a thought at all. It was more like a voice in the next room, steady and certain, and completely unsurprised. "I knew. I always knew." He put the crate back under the bed. He turned out the light. The apartment settled into its nighttime quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Marcus's light was still on under his door. Probably the chessboard. Probably working the endgame he'd been stuck on for a week. Raymond stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. Then he went to bed, and in the morning he got up at 4:30 and made coffee and drove to Caldwell Medical Institute and arrived before the parking lot filled up, when the building still smelled of floor wax and recycled air, and he signed in at the desk and said good morning to the security guard and took the service elevator to the 3rd floor. He had floors to clean. He started with the hallway by the east stairwell, where the linoleum always scuffed the worst, and he worked his way toward the far end of the corridor, moving slowly and evenly, the mop making its quiet sound against the floor. The building was still mostly empty. The overhead lights hummed at their low morning frequency. Somewhere above him, in the research wing, the day was already beginning. Equipment warming up, data printing out, someone's coffee growing cold beside a stack of papers. Raymond worked without hurrying. He had learned a long time ago that the things worth doing were worth the time they took, and that there was no point in doing any job as though you were somewhere else. He was right where he was. That had always been enough.